Hey, hello everyone and welcome to Extreme Graphics Tech. My name is Angelo and today I want to make this, I hope to be short video just to talk about Bottleneck. And what is Bottleneck? Well, Bottleneck is when one of the components on your computer, for example, makes another component don't get 100% of usage. Just to make it clear, if you, for example, CPU and GPU, and you have a GPU that is only being used 50% while the CPU is at 100% because the CPU is so slow that it cannot fully utilize the GPU. That's an example of bottleneck. And why I am bringing this to this channel now, today, at this moment. Well, this is a very small channel. As you know, I have a Spanish channel, which is bigger. This is a new project I started like a month ago. However, there is one video that has been quite well accepted, which is the video about the RX 6800. So that video is about 5,000 views, which doesn't sound like a lot to many, but considering the size of the channel, I think it's not bad video at all. So many people have said in that video that the CPU I'm using to test the RX 6800 is bottlenecking the results, and I want to then clarify some point to understand a little bit better the bottlenecking, and if it's true that the CPU I'm using is bottlenecking the GPU. Okay, so bottlenecking is not something that happens just automatically. Like if you pair an i3 with a 4090, it's not necessarily a bottleneck or a bad combination. You will say, how is it not to put a 4090 with an i3? Because bottlenecking will depend on many other things like settings, resolution, and performance you're looking for. So let's say this i3, you play Cyberpunk with the i3 at 1080p with a 2060. And you get 60 FPS at certain configuration. So that means no matter what, at the same configuration, your CPU should be able to get to 60 FPS. And all you care is about 60 FPS, okay? So if you buy a 4090, okay, and you keep playing at 1080p, yes, you are bottlenecking the 4090 because the i3 is only going to give you 60 FPS in this case. However, the 4090 is being used like 30% on 30% utilization because, well, you know, your CPU is not capable of more. However, the next day you buy an 8K monitor, and now things change because you want to play at 8K. What happens is that because it's an 8K monitor, all you want is 8K 60 FPS. However, now the 4090 is not capable of giving you 60 FPS at 8K, and it's only giving you 40. So what means now is that your CPU is not the bottleneck anymore. Things have changed. Now is the 4090 the bottleneck because that CPU has proven that it's capable of achieving at least 60 FPS on that game on specific settings that you set. So on the same settings, that CPU should give you 60 FPS on 8K, but the 4090 is not capable of. So the whole bottleneck situation has reverted now, just because you change a setting in the game. However, if you bought a 1080p 360 Hz monitor on a 4090, then the CPU is going to be the bottleneck because the 4090 is capable of getting to 360 frames per second on Cyberpunk. I am not sure if this is true, just making it up, but it's just to give you an example. But the i3 is not. So you realize that what you need to do now is to buy a faster CPU. So bottleneck is not something that is automatic. Okay, when you are spending your money, you need to understand when you're putting what it is that you're trying to achieve. Because this whole idea that your CPU and GPU needs to be of the same level, otherwise you are bottlenecking, is not necessarily true. So because if you don't care about, if what you care is about having higher resolution and higher fidelity, and you play at 60 FPS, maybe what you need to invest your money is not on a newer CPU, but on a GPU, because that's what you are doing. And remember, resolution and most graphical settings don't affect the CPU. And I say most because, as we are going to see next, some settings have an effect on the CPU, whether because it's ray tracing, whether because it's draw distance and so on. But some other settings, if you're playing on low or on ultra, you'll see that there is basically no difference. And if you're playing at 1080p or 1440p, also there is no difference sometimes in terms of what the CPU is able to achieve, because resolution doesn't affect the CPU. But let's see the examples, explain them, and then we come back to the conclusion. So starting with Dying Light 2 at 720p using DLSS performance, just to make sure that the GPU is not going to be the bottleneck, and at low with no ray tracing, we can see that this CPU is capable of achieving 140 FPS, at least in this scene. So we know that the maximum we can get out of this CPU is 140 FPS. So that's going to set the base for what we think is going to be the top of what the CPU is capable of provide. So as long as the whatever GPU we're using is not being fully utilized, if we get to that top, we know we are not going to get over it. So unfortunately, that means yes, you are going to have a CPU bottleneck in that case if you have GPU to spare. And this we can confirm, because when we put the game on ultra, we see that whatever settings this game has does not affect the CPU, because we get exactly the same frame rate, meaning that there is no option in the game that affects directly the CPU. So everything is GPU based, as we can see by the GPU utilization that went up, but still we are not bottlenecking the CPU with the GPU, because the GPU still has 20% room to spare. So we see that, yeah, that's the maximum we're gonna get no matter what. We can use whatever GPU we want. We are not going to get 100 more than that. So we're never going to fully utilize a 144 Hz monitor. When we use and we activate ray tracing, so what happens is that the CPU utilizations is higher, which means we are going to get less FPS, and that means we are going to get in this case 110 FPS. But because when I test game, what I'm trying to achieve is 60, I know that there is no situation where this CPU is not going to get to 60 as long as the GPUs allow for it. So I won't be bottlenecking in case that my end goal is to get to 60 FPS, no matter what configuration, no matter if I use ray tracing, no matter if I use ultra settings, no matter nothing, this CPU is absolutely capable of getting to 60 FPS, if that's my goal. When we test God of War, we have the same situation. We have around 100 FPS. This game is not using ray tracing or anything, and I know that's going to be the top. There may be circumstances where I get more because the scene is different, but just to an example, in this scene, I'm not going to get more than 95 to 100 FPS. So if I'm testing a GPU and I see that I get to 100 FPS and the GPU has room to spare, then I'm bottlenecking it. But if I'm getting 60 to 70 frames per second, I know that the problem is not the CPU, because the CPU has proven that can get to 100. I know that the problem is the GPU, and the limitation, whatever it is on the GPU and not on the CPU, because this CPU is capable of 100 frames on this particular game. So the situation of bottlenecking needs to be studied game by game, case by case. And on the game Spider-Man, we can test this even more clearly. If we put the game at 1080p DLSS performance on very high, we can see that we get around 95 frames per second, which is a good number, but means that we are not going to get to use a 144 Hz monitor no matter what GPU we use. As we can see, the GPU is only being 50% used because this CPU is not capable of delivering 144 Hz. However, it's capable of delivering more than 60, so we should be able to play at 60 with whatever CPU and resolution we use. And in this case, in the game Spider-Man, when we change from very high to very low, we can see we jump from 95 FPS to around 115 FPS, meaning that there is some graphical settings that definitely affect the CPU performance, and this is still without using ray tracing. So in this case, we know that that is the maximum the CPU is going to get when we're playing on very low, no matter the GPU. When we activate ray tracing on very high, we get around 75 to 77 frames per second. The GPU is still only 50% used, while the CPU has jumped in utilization because ray tracing is very heavy on the CPU. So here I am creating a bottleneck for the GPU because obviously my GPU is being underutilized. It's 50% of the performance is being left on the table in this particular case that I'm using. And this is we can see this that nothing changed and it's exactly the same performance even if I up the resolution to 1440p, and that's because, as I said before, resolution does not affect the CPU, frame rate does, because frame rate is the CPU has to prepare every frame and it's speeding frames as fast as it can. So in this case, even going 1440p, we are leaving 40% of performance on the table. So yes, the bottleneck is on the CPU in this particular case. But we have to be careful when we talk about bottlenecking, because now when we jump to 4K, the situation completely reversed, because now a CPU that I know is capable of 75 to 77 FPS is being only drawing 65 to 62 FPS, and that's because the GPU is the limiting factor here. So I know in this case that my CPU is more than enough to play this game at those resolutions and at those frame rates, but when I play a 4K, then my GPU is the bottleneck. So it changed the narrative, because the CPU is no longer the bottleneck in this particular case. So as you've seen, many of these games behave exactly the same no matter the resolution or the graphical configuration when the GPU is not the limitation. So your CPU, for example, on Dying Light is able of giving me 100 FPS, no matter if I'm playing on low or on ultra, if I'm playing on 1080p or 1440p, because I set the game in a specific way, so the GPU is not going to be limited. The game is not going to be limited by the GPU, but by the CPU. So by changing those options, because they don't affect the CPU, they behave exactly the same. The moment I change something that creates a bottleneck on the GPU, that's when the problem comes. Okay, because, well, not the problem, but then in the case of Spider-Man, you could see that 1080p and 1440p, there seems to be no difference. The CPU was the bottleneck in that case, but when you play the game at 4K, the CPU was not the bottleneck anymore, because I was getting less frames than I was getting before, and that's because now the GPU is at 100%, where the CPU is not being completely fully utilized. Even though you don't see 100% usage, that's because of many things like you know, how multi-core optimized it is, and frequency based and so on. So that's not discussion for this video. So what I'm trying to say here is that when people say to me, you're bottlenecking because the CPU you're using, yes, there may be a situation where I am bottlenecking because maybe I'm testing a 1080p GPU that is capable of a lot more, and the CPU is not capable of you know, doing more for that. But that's why when I test, what I do, and especially on the 10400F, is to try to create the bottleneck on the GPU. That's why I try to use higher resolution, so I don't see results that are being limited by the CPU but by the GPU itself, which is what I'm testing. And if you've seen my game review, well, my technical analysis of the games, what I have brought ever since I started the English channel is that I am testing the games running on an all i7 6700K. And the reason for that is because, especially right now, people are always like, oh my god, I need to have the latest and the greatest or I won't be able to play. And remember, my goal with my graphical analysis is not to show you how many frames you can get on certain games, on certain GPUs. What I'm trying to show you is how to achieve at least 60 FPS with the best quality possible and resolution. If you want to play at more FPS or whatever because you have a better graphical, well, you know at least that you can achieve that as a minimum. And if you can, well, then get to 30 FPS, if that makes sense for what I'm trying to say. So the moment I test with the i7-6700K, it gives me an idea already of how CPU dependent that game is. If I can get 80 or 60 or 100 frames on the i7-6000K, I already know I am not going to have any problem testing this game on the 10400F. So I know I can confidently test this game and know that CPU wise I am going to get 60 FPS. So at that point, what I try to do is to put the higher quality possible, like maybe more resolution, better settings, just to try to get that balance between the frame rate and quality. So I know the 10400F is going to give me more than 60 FPS. So now how do I achieve that with this particular GPU I'm testing? So the bottleneck is not something automatic, because if I am testing something like an RX 6800 at 4K, I really doubt that the 10400F is going to be the bottleneck. If I'm testing the same like Dota or Team Fortress or anything like that, a very esport game at 1080p with a 10400F, then yes, I'm going to be creating a bottleneck on that CPU, but that is not the sort of game I test in this channel. I tend to test game of, AAA games, AA games, games of certain levels, and I don't even use high-level GPUs, because what I'm trying to do is to show how it's going to behave for the majority of the people. It makes no sense, at least from my point of view, to show people who has a 4090 how the game is going to behave. I want people with a 1060, 2060, 3060, 6600, RX 580, and that sort of cars, or even the 5600 from AMD, to see how it's going to behave, because they are the more conscious, the ones that needs to first be sure that the game is going to be running okay on their system. If you have a 4090, I don't think there is any game in the world right now that is not going to be running probably at 4K max settings without issues. Okay, so for me, what I try to do with this analysis is to show that then if you have something better, good for you. You know that at least you're going to achieve certain level of quality. So on the talk about bottlenecking CPUs and all of this is the reason I test the way I do, and this is why I don't, even if there is a situation where I could be bottlenecking, I'm not worrying about that as long as I can get to 60 FPS. And with the 10400F, there is not an issue or not a game so far where this is not achievable, as long as the game is well optimized, because some games are just poorly optimized, like Batman Gotham Knights, where you cannot get to 60 on certain circumstances, even if you have a 3900K or a 7950X from Ryzen. So that's another story. So well, this is what I wanted to explain, or give you a little push in terms of understanding that bottlenecking is not an automatic thing. It doesn't have to do only with the selection of components, but also what is your goal and what you're trying to achieve when playing games. So I hope you like this video, and see you on the next one.